Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
If you take a perfectly healthy person, like someone with absolutely no psychiatric history, no neurological deficits at all.
Right, just a healthy baseline.
Yeah, exactly. And you give them a highly effective, super targeted antipsychotic medication. What do you think happens?
Most people would probably expect, their cognition to sharpen. Or maybe their mood to just elevate.
Right. But the reality is nothing beneficial happens. I mean, in fact, they might experience something completely unexpected and paradoxical, like severe agitation or even motor tremors.
Yeah, it's wild.
It is. We have this beautifully engineered chemical, and in a healthy brain, it either does absolutely nothing or it just causes pure chaos.
Which, really shatters the illusion that central nervous system pharmacology works like a simple lock and key. It just doesn't. Mm-hmm. We are dealing with an incredibly dynamic, structurally guarded, and frankly mysterious environment that actively resists interference.
So true. Well, welcome to this special edition of The Deep Dive, brought to you in partnership with the Last Minute Lecture team. And if you are listening to this, you are likely an advanced practice nursing or physician assistant student.
Which means you already know your anatomy, you know your peripheral physiology.
Yep. And now you are staring down the immense complexities of clinical prescribing. So today, we are focusing entirely on the core principles of LENS pharmacotherapeutics. Specifically, we're unpacking Chapter 18, the Introduction to Central Nervous System Pharmacology.
And our mission here is to, bypass the overwhelming textbook lists. We want to help you build the actual clinical decision-making framework you need for your rotations.
Exactly.
Because to safely prescribe or monitor or taper these medications, you really have to abandon the linear thinking that works for treating, say, a straightforward bacterial infection or a broken bone.
Yeah, it's a totally different ballgame.
It is. You need a deep understanding of the environment these drugs are entering. And that requires mastering the two primary gatekeeping concepts of the CNS, which are the blood-brain barrier and the incredibly vast network of CNS neurotransmitters.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's dive straight into that first physiological hurdle, the blood-brain barrier. Because before we can even debate the therapeutic value of a drug, we have to figure out how it physically gets inside the brain in the first place.
Right, which is not easy.
No, it's not. I like to visualize the blood-brain barrier not as a wall or even like a bouncer, but as this high-security, lipid filter, clean room airlock. It is a strict structural and chemical checkpoint that explicitly restricts entry to almost everything circulating in the systemic bloodstream.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the walls of that airlock are literal capillary endothelial cells.
Right.
And in the peripheral blood vessels, those cells actually have small gaps between them, so drugs can just slip through into the surrounding tissue. But in the central nervous system, those endothelial cells are fused together by tight junctions.
Like completely fused.
Exactly. There are zero gaps. So a drug circulating in the blood cannot simply slip between the cells. It actually has to pass directly through the cell membranes.
Which means the drug has to play by the rules of cellular membranes. So if a therapeutic agent is water-soluble or highly ionized or tightly bound to plasma proteins, it basically just bounces off the glass of the airlock.
It's strictly turned away.
Yeah. It cannot penetrate. But if a drug is highly lipid-soluble, it essentially melts right through the lipid bilayer of the endothelial cells and crosses into the brain.
Or, alternatively, it needs to have a very specific molecular pass to utilize the active transport systems embedded in the barrier.
Right. But wait, there's also an active defense mechanism at play here too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is critical for clinicians to understand. It's not just some passive filter. The barrier is heavily equipped with P-glycoprotein,
which is an efflux pump.
Exactly. So even if a potentially toxic molecule somehow manages to slip into the endothelial cell, P-glycoprotein acts as a molecular bouncer. It aggressively pumps that foreign substance right back out into the bloodstream before it can ever reach the brain tissue.
Okay, wait, I have a question here. If the blood-brain barrier is this, evolutionary masterpiece equipped with tight junctions and efflux pumps to keep toxins out, Why on earth do we deliberately prescribe highly lipid-soluble drugs that we know have massive systemic toxicity risks? Aren't we just intentionally picking the lock on the brain's security system?
Well, yeah, we are absolutely picking the lock, but we are doing it out of pure therapeutic necessity.
How so?
So from an evolutionary standpoint, the barrier is a massive advantage. It protects the brain. But from a pharmacological standpoint, it is a frustrating obstacle. Like if you have a patient suffering from bacterial meningitis, you desperately need an antibiotic to reach the infected meninges.
Right, but a lot of first-line antibiotics are water-soluble.
Exactly. Or highly protein-bound. So they cannot cross the barrier in sufficient concentrations. We are forced to select specific lipid-soluble agents that can bypass that security system. And that inevitably carries the risk of broader systemic side effects.
Ah, I see. Which brings up a major clinical safety alert from the text, particularly for those of you listening who are going into pediatrics or family practice. Wait, if the barrier is the brain's ultimate defense, what happens when it isn't fully built yet?
That is a massive safety priority. Because at birth, those tight junctions we just talked about are not fully developed.
They aren't completely fused.
Right. And the protective P glycoprotein pumps are also not fully expressed or functioning at adult capacity. So the physiological reality here is that the infant brain is highly exposed to the systemic circulation.
Wow. So the clinical implication of those unfused tight junctions is profound. Infants are exponentially more sensitive to CNS drugs than older children and adults.
Exponential.
Like a lipid-soluble drug that might just cause mild sedation in a healthy 30-year-old can trigger massive, overwhelming respiratory and CNS depression in a newborn.
Yeah.
Because the drug just floods into the brain unchecked.
Exactly. You absolutely cannot treat an infant like a miniature adult. Your dosing, your drug selection, your monitoring parameters, they all must account for an underdeveloped blood-brain barrier. You have to exercise extreme caution.
So, okay, getting the drug past the barrier, whether in an adult or an infant, is really only the first part of the therapeutic journey. Once the drug actually breaches the airlock, it doesn't just find a neat, orderly row of receptors waiting for it.
No, not at all. It drops into a highly complex chemical jungle.
Which brings us to the second gatekeeping concept, the sheer, crowded dance floor of CNS neurotransmitters.
And the scale of complexity here is just staggering when you compare it to the peripheral nervous system.
Right. When you study peripheral pharmacology, it feels, well, manageable. You are essentially dealing with three main chemical messengers: acetylcholine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. You learn the receptors, you map the pathways, and you're good. But inside the central nervous system,
Yeah, it's a different world.
there are over 100 different compounds that serve as neurotransmitters. Though, to be fair, the text notes, fewer than 30, actually have established roles in therapy.
True, but even that is a massive network.
Yeah. And just to break down box 18.1 from the text really quickly, to give you a sense of this diversity, we're talking about monoamines like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine.
Amino acids too, right?
Yep, amino acids like GABA, glutamate, aspartate, glycine, plus purines like adenosine and ATP. Then you've got opioid peptides like endorphins and enkephalins, non-opioid peptides like oxytocin and substance P, and others like histamine. It is just an impossibly dense web.
It really is. But what's fascinating here is a rather shocking truth revealed in the source material. Out of all those compounds you just listed, absolutely none of them have been definitively proven to serve as CNS neurotransmitters.
Wait, really? None of them?
Not a single one. The technical difficulties in CNS research make absolute 100% proof impossible right now. To get absolute proof, you have to demonstrate a compound's presence in a presynaptic terminal, show its release upon stimulation, identify its specific mechanism on the postsynaptic cell, and prove a mechanism for its removal.
And doing that in a living human brain without destroying the tissue is just beyond our current technology.
Precisely.
Okay, but just to clarify for everyone listening, we aren't completely in the dark here. We aren't just making wild guesses. While absolute proof is lacking, the evidence for compounds like dopamine, norepinephrine, and enkephalins is considered completely convincing by the scientific community.
Oh, absolutely. We have decades of clinical data, but we still lack the kind of irrefutable proof we have in the periphery.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If we can't absolutely prove how these neurotransmitters work, how do we confidently explain a drug's mechanism of action to a patient sitting in our clinic?
That requires scientific humility. You have to understand that our knowledge of brain health and disease is limited. Therefore, any proposed mechanisms of action we study are tentative.
They are our best scientifically informed guesses.
Exactly. And they will likely be modified or completely discarded as we learn more. So when you talk to a patient, you shift the focus. When CNS drugs are taken long-term, the brain adapts.
Ah, yes.
The waiting game.
Right. This adaptation explains why drugs like antipsychotics and antidepressants must be taken for several weeks, sometimes up to 2 months, before full therapeutic effects develop.
Because the benefit doesn't come from the immediate effect on the synapse.
No, it doesn't. The immediate effect, like blocking serotonin reuptake, happens within hours. But the actual benefit comes from the brain's gradual adaptive changes. The brain structurally remodels itself in response to that sustained chemical signal.
Wow. Okay, so if the brain is continuously adapting to give us therapeutic benefits over time, does it adapt to the bad stuff too? Like, do side effects get worse, or do they become a permanent baseline?
That's a great question, and actually the text provides a really reassuring clinical example here. Often, side effects actually decrease.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. For example, when a patient starts taking the anti-seizure drug phenobarbital, it produces profound sedation at first.
Right, they feel super sluggish.
Exactly. But over time, the brain adapts.
Yeah.
The compensatory circuits learn to filter it out, so the sedation declines, while the full therapeutic protection from seizures remains totally intact.
That is incredible. But this raises an important question, doesn't it? Adaptation isn't always beneficial.
No, it is definitely not. This is the exact mechanism behind tolerance and physical dependence.
The dark side of adaptation.
Right. Tolerance is a decreased response occurring over prolonged use. The brain adapts, so the original dose doesn't work anymore, and the patient requires more of the drug.
And physical dependence is when the brain has adapted so much that it actually requires the drug to function normally.
Exactly. It becomes a structural load-bearing beam in their neurochemistry. So if you abruptly stop the drug, you trigger a severe withdrawal syndrome. And that syndrome lasts until the brain's adaptive changes revert back to their pre-treatment state.
Which is why tapering is a non-negotiable mandate for so many CNS medications. You have to shave that support away slowly so the brain can upregulate its receptors safely.
Factoring that adaptation into your timelines and tapering protocols is just the cornerstone of responsible prescribing.
Okay, so knowing how complex, heavily guarded, and adaptable this brain environment is, it kind of makes you wonder, how do scientists ever manage to invent new psychiatric medications?
Well, the uncomfortable reality is they mostly don't do it on purpose.
Yeah. Because of our lack of neurochemical knowledge, it is practically impossible to take a rational approach to developing truly new psychotherapeutic agents. Historically, virtually all major advances in psychopharmacology have been totally serendipitous.
Complete accidents.
Just accidental discoveries.
And there are two major roadblocks explaining exactly why this is the case. First, we lack adequate animal models for mental illness.
Right. You can't genetically engineer a rat to experience severe bipolar mania.
Exactly. And second, you cannot test potential psych drugs on mentally healthy human subjects, because the drugs either have zero therapeutic effect on them, or they produce paradoxical, unexpected effects that tell you nothing about how it works in a diseased brain.
So what does this all mean for the future of drug development?
Well, the text outlines a specific formula for small advances. Once a lucky drug is discovered accidentally, scientists synthesize structural analogs.
They make minor chemical tweaks.
Yeah, they run biochemical screening tests, rule out severe toxicity, and test those promising agents in humans. This method creates drugs with fewer side effects or slightly better profiles, but it rarely yields major therapeutic breakthroughs.
It's iteration, not innovation, which explains why this entire unit will feel different from studying the peripheral nervous system. Because our knowledge of CNS transmitters is so insufficient, we can't learn the transmitters first and the drugs second. Instead, you have to study CNS drugs and neurotransmitters concurrently.
You learn the drug alongside the tentative role of the neurotransmitter it affects.
Right. So as we wrap up, let's synthesize the core takeaways for you to carry onto the floor. Approach CNS pharmacology with deep clinical humility. Remember the strict gatekeeping of the blood-brain barrier, especially in infants. Recognize the vast but unproven network of neurotransmitters, and heavily factor brain adaptation into your patient education regarding timelines, side effects, and withdrawal.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today. If all our major psychotherapeutic drugs were discovered completely by accident, and we can't accurately model mental illness in animals or test on healthy humans, what incredibly effective, life-changing treatments might be sitting right under our noses right now, just waiting for the next serendipitous accident to be discovered?
wild to think about. Thank you so much for studying with the Last Minute Lecture team on this deep dive today. We wish you the absolute best of luck on your upcoming clinicals and exams, and we will catch you next time.